right? In fact, they're highly autocratic, right? As opposed to some of the contemporary societies that are highly prosperous today, most of which are not autocratic, they're democratic, right? So this idea that emphasis in obedience, which is characteristic of more autocratic societies, that somehow that was never good for economic development, that's not true, right? There was this emergence of institutional development that we see as democratization that critically played the role of improving economic performance. And that channel is also correlated with how individual societies are, right? That de-emphasizes obedience and imbues a sense of one's controlling life. Does that make sense, or am I confusing you more? Let me just go back to, where are you? Can you shoot me a question again so that I can see that pop-up window? Because I seem to have lost it. Where are you? Ah, there, thanks. Right, I got to more emphasize this. Yeah, so this is partially right in Hume, except that at least in the early stages of development, right, the more emphasis on obedience, again, as I mentioned, was more characteristic of societies that had early starting civilization, became more autocratic, more centralized, therefore became more strong, right? But that kind of institutional quality that led to initial economic development was not sustained in the grand scheme of long term, right? Because now the societies that emphasize less obedience and more sense of control, that are more characteristic of individual societies, that are more democratic as well, those are the ones that are performing better. So there seems to have been a shift in terms of what makes a good institution, and the emphasis on obedience seems to have not done so well in the long run. But in the initial phase, it did very well. Think about China, for example. Huge empire, millennia, dominant force in the world. I mean, it's coming back, but for a long time, at least in the past 200 years, it was not doing so well. Yeah? Okay, so let me go back to my slides. What the previous slides suggest is that there's something that's missing from Diamond's hypothesis, right? What we actually find is that there's a negative association between time since agricultural transition and current levels of income within each agricultural core, right? The key intermediate links here are culture and political institutions. Remember in the past paper, I talked about how early adoption of agriculture is associated with more collectivist societies, right? Now I'm going to introduce yet another intermediate link, which is the political institution. And as I kind of hinted at the idea of democratic institutions. So those democratic institutions, you are more likely going to see in late agricultural societies, right? So these two seem to be critical channels that could explain why there's a negative association between Neolithic transition and current levels of income. That is not really discussed in Jared Diamond's book. Any questions about this? All right. So here's a diagram that could maybe help you better to understand the overall argument. So you have early Neolithic revolution, early formation of autocratic states, and out-migration of individuals to farmers. And then there's persistence of institutions based on the types of farmers that stayed and formed that society, right? Such that when you take a look at late agricultural societies that were founded by these individualist farmers, you tend to have better current economic performance. All right, so let me skip some of these things because this class is really not about data analysis, but this is just to show you that some of the rigorous empirical exercises that were involved in claiming this point. Okay. Term validity. Now, what do we see here? So this is interesting. Okay, so what you see here is that when you have early agricultural adoption, as far back as 1000 AD, that actually was good for you, right? As in early adoption of agriculture, a la hypothesis by Jared Diamond, you actually performed better than the ones that were late adopters of agriculture. But over time, by 1500, that relation turns negative, and then it keeps dropping down, right? So another way to interpret this result is that early agriculture adoption gives you a head start in civilization, accompanied by autocratic institutions emphasizing obedience, less emphasis on individual control or independence. And that kind of model seemed to have worked just fine up until 1000 AD, which is also a time period where you see emergence of a lot of different empires that are uniformly autocratic in nature, right? But at the pivotal time period of 1500, when you see the emergence of democratic institutions in Europe, you see the relationship between agricultural adoption rate and GDP dropping to negative. And then from then on, it just goes down, right? So again, this culture, the individualism, and democratic institution, the institutional channel, these two combined seem to suggest that the late adopters benefited in certain aspects that for a long time were not enough to kind of win over the more autocratic early adopter advantage. But when there was institutional innovation that most prominently took off beginning in 1500, that channel seemed to outperform the previous channel, right? So now you have the late adopters perform much better today. And this goes back to kind of explaining why you see Sweden and UK being more prosperous nations compared to Iraq and Turkey and so forth. All right, so that was a pretty long-winded explanation for what happened with the Neolithic Revolution. And I'm going to skip some of these things because I want to explore some of the other papers with you. Okay. Yeah, just to conclude, time since agricultural transition still appears to have a longer impact on contemporary cultural norms and levels of prosperity. Institutions, political institution is a likely intermediate mechanism as well as the cultural divergence, individualist versus collectivist. So why did we do this exercise? Because we understand the reversal within the Western agricultural core cannot be explained with Jared Diamond's global theory. In order to make sense out of his theory, you really have to look at it at the global level. But it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to connect each of the independent agricultural core as part of the data, the same data set, because they had independent mechanisms or independent spread of agriculture that was highly distinct from one another. So bundling them up as a single data set does not make empirical sense. So when you parse them out, and then when you're testing out each of the agricultural core, then you start to realize that the relationship is negative and not positive. Okay. So that's the takeaway from these papers. Any questions before we move on to the next topic? No? Okay. Let's talk about another paper. So this one is talking about historical state stability and economic development in Europe. Now, I told you that there are several challenges dealing with historical data, but also making grand claims that stretches back thousands of years ago, right? Any kind of claim that you're making that traces its roots back to the Neolithic Revolution is going to come to a lot of criticism, because you're trying to essentially make an association between something that happened 10,000 years ago to explain what happened today, right? Can you imagine? It's 10,000 years ago. There's a lot of things that happen in between. So this kind of exercise, although I continue to be interested in, I also realized that it's much harder to convince others. So what I'm going to try to do now is to show you another paper that does not cut across such a broad time span, but it gives you a shorter time span. So now this paper is going to look at what happened over 2,000 years as opposed to 10,000 years. I mean, it's still very long, but it's in some ways more defendable, right? Because you don't have to explain what happened for like 8,000 years. It's only 2,000 years. Okay. So the motivation for this work is the following. What is the impact of sovereign state changes on current economic development, and can we measure these changes in some sort of systematic way? So let me give you just a brief time to kind of ruminate, like digest what this motivating question is. Okay. Does anyone have a question about the question itself, what it reads on the slide right now? I want you to understand what the question is before we actually delve into the material. Are you saying that all 89 of you understand perfectly what this means? I'm impressed. Okay. Let's move on then. Economic development. Yeah. Okay. I have a question. I cannot understand. Thank you, Im So-young. I'm sure like 30 of you do not understand, but Im So-young 학생 was courageous enough to say it. Thank you for that. Okay, so let me try to explain what this means. Suppose you have a country, right? And I guess we can look at Korea, right? So, well, maybe Korea was not a good example. What would be a country that faced a lot of sovereign state turnovers? So by turnovers, I mean it was one country before, and they became another country, and they became yet another country, and they came. You know what I mean? So same country could be invaded, it could be colonized, it could gain independence, but they can turn into different regime altogether. Could become part of an empire. So these are all state changes I'm talking about. Korea, I suppose, in recent centuries, you could say it was Gojoseon, right? And then there was, forgive me, I'm really, I should know this because I also do Korean economic history, but then there was like Samguk-시대, and then there's reunification under Silla, and then it turned to Goryeo, and then it went to Joseon, and then it became part of Japan, and then it became independent, but it's now split. So there are lots of different sovereign state changes in Korea, the Korean peninsula too, right? So what is the impact of these sovereign state changes on current economic development? So that's what this paper is trying to measure, right? Does that make sense now? Tell me before I move on, because it's important to understand the question before we start with the answers, right? Okay. Any other questions? Does everyone understand? If not, let me know. Anyone? Okay. All right. Hopefully, in the next few slides, it will make more sense to some of you who may not still understand. Okay. We know that economic development has been associated with a lot of different things, right? These are some of the things that I've listed here, but there are many others. Physical and human capital, size and cost of heterogeneity, geography, institutions, state longevity and stability. I'm going to focus a lot on the last point, state longevity and stability. Okay? So in this paper, what I try to do is to attempt to examine the effect of multiple sovereign state changes on economic development. What does that mean? It means if you see a lot of changes in the country itself, so suppose, Korea stayed Korea, but then became Japan, but then became China, and it became its own kingdom, but it was called under a different name. and it became Korea again, these multiple sovereign state changes, is that good for this peninsula or is it not? This place, does it benefit from these multiple changes or is it bad? So that's the question at hand. Okay? Right. So on the one hand, you can say, well, it's bad if you have a lot of changes because then there's going to be a lot of war and violence. People will not have an incentive to invest, right? For the future. I mean, if you don't know that you're going to have the same government next year, would you necessarily want to save up, invest in business? Maybe not, right? So instability is usually not good, especially when it comes to individual decision-making process in investment, right? Does everyone agree with that? But on the other hand, yeah, thanks. Yes. Okay. So we have a lot of yeses. Can anyone think of why instability could be good? So I think it's pretty clear to say, well, if I don't know if the same government's gonna be ruling, if we're going to be under the rule of the same government, so there's this predictable outcome in the next few 50 years. If we don't have that faith, if we don't have that confidence that the same government is going to rule this country, then I think a lot of yeses, yeah. So I think a lot of people agree that it's going to be bad for economic development. But can someone give us a counter argument to say, you know what, instability is actually good? What would be the argument for saying that, yeah, it's unstable government is actually good? Yeah, so Emian, thank you. That's exactly it. New and advanced technologies could be learned. So there's something about creative destruction, I like to say, that if you are able to raise down the existing institutions or government, that could be an opportunity for the place to learn from and adopt new innovative technologies or institutions and so forth. So North Korea, for example, right? It could be considered to be highly stable institution in the sense that the Kim dynasty has been able to kind of have its grasp on its power for 3 generations, right? That is stable autocracy, right? But is that stability good for North Korea? Probably not, right? So if there's some sort of disruptive, unstable potential for disruption and creative destruction, that's an example where you could say, well, it's time for change, right? So it's not clear whether stability is always good. It's not clear whether instability is always good. So this paper is trying to see at which point, if you were to quantify the number of changes in a place, how many changes or up to how many changes do you see positive benefit from these turnovers? And at which point do you start seeing the negative effect of turnovers? So that's what this paper is about. Any question about this? Okay. Before we go on to the analysis, we need to figure out how we define sovereign states. And I'm sure many of you might have the same question, like what does it mean to be a sovereign state? There are many different ways to define. Many different ways to define a sovereign state. So one crucial element of a sovereign state would be the following. It's a territory delimited by borders with a population and an authority exercising the effective public power on population and territory, and with supremacy, that is, with capacity to control absolutely the territory and the population, right? So these are reasonable, these are crucial elements that reasonably define what a sovereign state is, right? And the term is broader in concept than democracy, autocracy, and regime. So these are regime types, right? we're only going to concern ourselves with sovereign states. And then look at what mean duration of state rule might be. Okay, so this is based on the total number of different sovereign states that rule a region, conditional on the centuries of state presence. To reiterate what this means, consider the time span of 20 centuries. So I told you this is going to be an exercise over 2,000 years. So within 2,000 years, you take a look at a particular region, and given that region, you might have, let's say, 15 centuries of some state rule over the region, right? But for 5 centuries, it was not ruled by any governing body, right? So then we need to condition the mean state duration of rule on the centuries of state presence. So given 15 centuries of some rule by some state, how many sovereign state changes were there? So this is an empirical exercise that can be done, okay? And it's meant to capture both the variation in different states' rule and the length of state presence. Okay, I'll give you what the main finding of this analysis is. What we find is that there's a nonlinear inverse U relationship between the mean duration of state rule and current local income level. What does that mean? Let me show you. But before, also what we find is that the relationship holds after controlling for geography, timing of early state formation, and also present day state fixed effects. And then we'll not go into robustness checks because I think it's not too relevant for this class. So this finding here, nonlinear inverse U relationship between the mean duration state rule and current local income level. What this will suggest to you is that when you have some turnovers, state turnovers, it can be good for economic development, right? And there's a positive slope up to a certain point. So the more turnovers that you have, the better you are economically. But there comes a point where that trend reverses, right? Such that the more frequent turnovers that you have, you're going to suffer economically, right? So that's what I mean by inverse U. So use this and inverse use that, right? It's like a hump. It's a non-linear relationship. Okay. Any question about this? No? All right. So why do we see this non-linear relationship? Allow me to go over some of the arguments that could help us understand it better, right? So one could argue that sovereign states are put in place as rules of the game, and they will perform better than anarchy, right? But having sovereign states in place are necessary, but they are not sufficient for growth, okay? At the same time, some changes can be good. So old sovereign state may result in inefficient institutions. New sovereign state may lead to better institutions and new ideas. And this is an argument that Inio and Hakseng voiced out, right? That you could have this opportunity for innovations and adoption of new ideas, right? Inflow of technology and ideas, increase in state capacity, right? Does everyone agree that sovereign states in any form might be better than anarchy? Does everyone know what anarchy is? Tell me if you don't know, because again, I'm telling you, out of 89 students, if you don't know, probably a third of the class do not know. So I need to know how much you know, right? What does it mean by putting in place rules of game? Yeah, so thank you, Choi Byung-hwa. Kim Han-bon state that government doesn't, correct. So anarchy just refers to absence of government, right? Yeah, okay. So what does it mean by putting in place rules of game? So the government or sovereign state or state in its simplest form, economists are describing it as public good, right? Where you have kind of mutually agreed upon enforcer of rules of game. So rules of game can be anything. So to give you an example, the government has to exist to enforce law, right? Traffic lights, for example. The government is taking on that role to provide certain rules of game so that it leads to better transactions and more efficient outcomes amongst individuals. Does that make sense? So that's in its most elementary form what government does. It facilitates transactions amongst ourselves by reducing transaction costs and information asymmetry. So when the government provides such functions, then you can say that any kind of entity that provides those that cannot be provided by individual alone, then we are better than anarchy to have a government of some sort. That's what I mean by put in place rules of game. Does that make sense, Chedong and others? Because again, it's not just you. I think other people might be confused too. Yeah? Shall I move on? Okay, good. Got it. Thanks, Kim Jun. All right, so what does it mean? Okay, so you have presence of state being better than anarchy. But at the same time, some changes can be good, especially when that institution, the sovereign state itself, is not very good, right? Very sticky institutions that are highly autocratic, that seems to extract from the citizens, then you need opportunities for change. But how many changes is good and how many changes are bad? How frequent can these state turnovers be in order to maximize your economic performance in the long run? So that's the question at hand. Okay. Let me see if I can. Okay, what's going on? Okay. So frequent sovereign state changes may be associated with continuous violence and destruction, little incentive to invest in state building, right? Lacking in bureaucratic infrastructure and experience. So this goes to maybe suggest a nonlinear relationship, right? And that's exactly what we find. So I think we kind of cover these aspects of why you think there could be a nonlinear relationship between state turnovers and economic outcome in the long run. Any questions before I move on? Okay. Let me tell you how one can operationalize this kind of inquiry into empirical analysis, right? We utilize a set of maps from Eurythmus. This is a set of historical maps on Europe from the year 180 to 2080, every 100 years for each century. Yeah, question for you. What is a nonlinear relationship? So it's a relationship that's not straight. It's like curved like this. Can you see my hand? It's like a hump, right? Right. I mean, nonlinear relationship in general just means that relationship that's not linear. So it's not like a straight line, right? But it's like that. Right? So what I wish I had a blackboard to show you, but I think I have a graph that actually shows this nonlinear curve. So bear with me. So historical maps in Europe from the year 180 to 2080, every 200 years. What this map shows us is that it gives us political boundaries of different units, sovereign rulers, dependent states. And using geographic information system, which is a software for digital mapping, you can overlay these maps on top of each other. To figure out what kind of political changes occurred in a particular geographical area through time. So let me show you what that looks like on a map, okay? And I'm just gonna skip this because, so this is what it looks like. Does anyone have an idea what this map shows us? Like, what is the impression that you get here? Just take a guess. Let me know what you think. Anyone? Anyone have an idea of what this means? Why it looks like this? Change of borders. Yes, you are exactly right. Expansion of those states' territories. Yeah, there were many wars in West Europe, correct. Where do you see most wars, or where do you see most state border changes in this map? Where do you see it? Yeah, Germany, right? So we know that during medieval periods, there are thousands of princely kingdoms in Germany, and they kind of dissolved and they merged, and there's like different iterations of split and mergers. Italy too, you're right. So there are lots of splits and reunification efforts in Italy. The unified Italy as we know it today, it only goes back to what, late 1800s or early 1900s. Yeah, it's pretty recent. Before then, there are lots of these different kingdoms, right? Surprisingly enough, France has managed to stay unified without too many border changes for a very long time, relative to others, right? So we're not talking about France relative to China, for example. But yeah, so what's interesting here is that you have 21 layers of maps that gives you country or state borders over different time periods. And then this is just stacking those maps on top of each other, 21 of them in total, so that you can see which part of Europe experienced the most frequent border changes. That's pretty neat, right? So it helps you to kind of visualize where these boundary changes happen. Okay, so then the next question here is to figure out, well, we know that certain areas experience more border changes, but if we're going to do some sort of empirical analysis, what do we need to do next? We need to figure out what the unit of analysis is going to be, right? Because we're going to generate data set that gives you on the left-hand side the GDP per capita today, the contemporary income level, explained by how many border sovereign state changes occurred in a particular local place. But we need to figure out how to define that place. What is the unit, the measured unit that we're going to figure out or create to calculate and trace the boundary changes? It can't be just contemporary borders, right? Because they are all different sizes. By the way, the red lines here, those red lines depict the modern country borders in 2080. Okay. So if you were to run this empirical exercise, how would you create unit of analysis? Do you guys have any idea of what you can do? How would you determine, like how would you decide upon the size of the unit? Again, you're looking for some local area to extract information on how many border changes that area experienced over 2,000 years. But you need to figure out what the size of that unit should be. 10 what exactly? What do you mean by 10? Are you talking about 10 observations or 10 kilometers? What language they use? Oh, that's interesting. That's true. 10 observations. But we're running data analysis, right? And I would say like the minimum benchmark for the number analysis that you should be prepared to generate is 30. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to make any kind of general implication or inference. Okay, so I'm going to hold you to that thought. So think about how you will be able to operationalize empirical EDS analysis, coming up with a unit of analysis. Okay, but we're going to take a break for 10 minutes because I've been talking for about an hour, 15 minutes, and I'm sure you guys need a break. So let's reconvene in 10 minutes. So we'll come back to our lecture at 5 o'clock. Does that sound good? Okay. All right. So go to the restroom, get a grab a cup of coffee or something, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes. The Dynast count the name of the changes in the last name. Yeah. So in here, that's kind of the idea, to figure out, if you had the same kind of dynasty that ruled over this period from like say 200 to 300 AD, then that is considered as a continuation of the same entity that ruled over a period. So that wouldn't be included as the count. So it's not. So the number of times that you change will be dependent on how many dynasties, different dynasties took over that particular region. Okay. Yeah. So go to the restroom or grab a cup of coffee. I will see you guys back in 10 minutes at 5 p.m. Okay. Yeah. 이동엽, do you have a question? Oh, I think I just hold on. What happened here? What's 수강 정정? What does that mean? Class shopping. Okay. So you're telling me that you need to be excused maybe 10 minutes early. Is that what you're asking for? Because there is something going on at 6:30. If that's the case, that's fine. We can end a bit early. No worries. But I'll still see you at 5. So I'll see you guys in 7 minutes, okay?